Music theory with OneNote. Scale degree chords versus modal chords. This time looking at the major chords, those built off the major modal points from a Nashville number system, those being the 1, 4, 5, the 1, the Ionian modal point or major scale, the 4, the Lydian modal point, the 5, the Mixolydian modal point, and therefore a Mixolydian chord. So get ready and some coffee, because although we're just playing with one note, it's a beautiful note. You're not required to, but if you have access to it and would like to follow along, we're currently in the OneNote file of Modal Node System, MNS Presentation 1359, OneNote Scale Degree Chords versus Modal Chords, Major Mode Chords, list of presentations on the right, which we plan on adding plenty more to shortly. Also noting, in this OneNote presentation, we'll spend our time on the music theory side of things, but we have another similarly numbered and named presentation where we build these tables in Excel, practicing music, Excel, and table visualization skills at the same time. Let's go down to our objective, that being to look at the chords in the most efficient way possible. Now, this is going to be the way the chords are often visualized if you try to pack them all into a table under their normal construction, noting some of the problems here being that I can't really see which of these chord constructions will apply to each of the points of what we're typically working in a 7-note collection. Let me show you what I mean on a fretboard. This is our fretboard's a little bit longer, each fret now having 2 sides to it, but we still have the low or heavy E string, the one closest to the ceiling on top. Still looking at the 7-note collection built around the C major. Here's a C here, here's a C on fret number 3. The first side of the fret representing the point, which could be the note, which would be 4 or note number C, or it can be the relative modal point, the continent in our analogy, which from a Nashville number system would be 1, or from a nodal system, the Ionian node. The second half is going to give us the distance from a normal scale degree, that being a perfect first from the perspective of this C, or it could be a 0 note away from the Ionian node, 0 modal half step from a modal distance perspective. If I go from fret 3 to fret 5 on this string, we're going up 2 notes. That would take me from the Ionian node to the Dorian node. The distance then is 2 notes away, which we typically call then a major second. Now, this breakout is quite useful when we think about chord construction, because when we want to construct a chord, we're actually not all that specific about it oftentimes, particularly in just normal kind of like pop music or popular type of music. Because when you're looking at old school music, they really typically used multiple different instruments to possibly build up the chords and whatnot. And we kind of have a shorthand for chord construction in basically like pop music that you can kind of play with. You're going to say, okay, we're going to do a major chord. And then you can kind of say, well, should I invert the chord and so on and so forth and play it in different ways. So we have this interplay of how specific do we want to be and how much leeway do we want to give for like improv kind of setup as well. So naming the chord then is usually going to be built around the notes that are in the 7-note collection, meaning you can build chords that include notes that are, say, what I would call in the ocean. They're not in the 7-note collection. But to do so, you would expect those chords to be a little bit more complex in the naming convention, right? If you name the chords with just the 7 notes in the 7-note collection, in other words, if I build any chord from the notes in this 7-note collection, you would expect the chord name should be fairly easy because they're all the notes that are in the key. That's my perspective of it. Now, that's not exactly what has happened historically, because historically, when they really started getting technical about chord names, they only were really working in the major key, the Ionian, and then they tacked on the minor key. So that means later on, they kind of shoehorned in the Mixolydian, for example, which is quite popular, right? It's a kind of a fun kind of key to be playing in. And the rest of them, the Phrygian, all the rest of them, particularly the Locrian, is just a complete mess under the normal kind of naming convention. Now, the other problem with the normal naming convention is that we're basically naming it by the name of the note, which is going to be the note name, which is okay. You could do that, but it doesn't really tell you the relative position. So if I build something off of the C note and I call it a C major, then I don't really know if it's going to be an Ionian node that I'm building off of, or if it's another major modal node, meaning I'm going to get the same distances for the triads if I build a 3-note chord off of the Mixolydian as well as the Lydian nodes. It's not very specific functionally within where I am in the song or on the fretboard or whatever basically instrument that you're going to be playing in is going to be one of the kind of functional problems with it. Also, from a functional standpoint, I can't move it I can't transpose it easily, because if I transpose it, I have to figure out the relative position that I'm in and then change all the relative note names, which isn't the optimal way the system's designed. It seems quite clear that the system is designed that you can name everything by relative position, meaning I don't name the chord. If I name the chord by the Ionian node, it's an Ionian triad, then everything is maneuverable. I can write the whole song without a reference to a note, but just relative chord positions, allowing me to easily maneuver the song through all 12 collections of 7 notes. Not that it's going to preclude us from playing notes in what I would call the ocean, but I can still name those notes in relative position to the collection of notes that I'm looking at. And that way it's totally maneuverable. No other adjustment is needed. I know all the relative positions. In other words, the optimal way to write the song and name the song is to say, look, just like the Nashville number system does, I'm in the collection of notes that I'm going to name around the key of C, and then I'm going to tell you which point of those notes is going to be the tonic of those collection of notes, and then I'm going to name everything, melody and chords, from the perspective of the nodal points, which from a Nashville number system is 1 through 7. If you play a 1-4-5, it's a 1-4-5, right? Now, if I change the perspective as we did and if we change the perspective as we did down here and make the Dorian now the chord we're playing in, or the tonic, meaning I'm in the same collection of 7 notes, but now the Dorian is the tonic, you can see that the second side of each of our frets has changed. This was a perfect first for the C up top. Now we have the perfect first for the Dorian. That's perfect for us to build chords, because now I'm building from the distance of the perspective of the Dorian. So from a Nashville number system, you would typically say, I'm still looking at the collection of notes around the key of C, but I'm making the tonic the Dorian. I'm not going to renumber the system. I'm just going to say the Dorian is the one that we're going to gravitate towards, would be the general idea. So what do we want from a functional standpoint, as is indicated or shown or gravitated towards from the Nashville number system? What I want to know is, what are the notes in the key that I'm playing, and what kind of chord can I build from them? To do that, we compare the distances from each of the notes. What's the distance? Meaning, which of the distances are going to land me in the ocean versus another continent? I basically want to be building the chords that are not going to land me in the ocean. Therefore, I can simply list out the 7 notes that aren't the oceans, the continents, in order, as though I'm going around a block, and then I just pick every other note. That's how we build the chords. So I'd like to name it by nodal point, basically, would be the most functionally optimal way to do it. Notice what's happening up here is we're not doing that, right? If you look at a chord chart and I say, look, these are major chords, that doesn't tell me if I'm playing an Ionian nodal point or a Mixolydian or a Lydian. If I add the 7 to it, a major 7, that means, what does that mean? Well, that means it's either Ionian or Lydian, right? It means I have to know that the Mixolydian doesn't fit into that. If I say it's a major 9 and whatnot, now I have to know what the 9 means and everything. If I say it's a minor chord, it doesn't tell me if it's an Aeolian chord or if it's a Dorian or a Phrygian chord, right? If it's a dominant 7, they shoehorned in the 7 to show, look, if you play a triad, the Mixolydian is going to be the Mixolydian is just a major chord. But if you add the 7, because the Mixolydian has a flat 7, then we're just going to make a whole nother category for dominant 7 chords, right? And then the diminished, they had to do the same thing because, of course, the diminished is the Locrian chords primarily, and it doesn't fit. So then they had to make this whole thing for the half diminished. And then these extensions are extensions that you need even if you're just playing in the 7-note collection. So you can see that this chord chart is not optimal for what you really want to do, right? What I want to do is know which chords I'm going to be able to construct from each of the 7 notes in the collection of notes that I'm working in. And if you do that by relative position, you can have one chart that works for you for all 12 collections of 7 notes, right? It's only when you go in the ocean that something weird should happen. All right, so that as our premise, let's go back on over here and say, remember what we're trying to do here. We've got our collection of notes, which are going to be A through G sharp. I'm going to name the ones that are sharps and flats with a small A, B in the middle. And we're going to basically work in the key of C. So we apply our formula from the standpoint of the key of C, which is going to be whole step, half step, whole step, whole step, whole step, half step. Now, why do we work in the key of C? Because you don't have to work with sharps and flats. It gets us a nice check figure, but the distances are all the same. So once I work out the distances, I can then name those points, which are typically going to be the Greek naming convention. So now these are the notes in the key of C. I'd rather just simply know them by number, as is done by the Nashville number system, 1 through 7. And even if I switch to any other of the 11 out of 12 collections of 7 notes, these relative positions and numbers will be the same, and the distance from each of the numbers to the other numbers, as long as we keep those numbers constant, will be the same in terms of total distance. So those total distances, again, apply. It's not like we're just working in the key of C, which oftentimes you will see in the piano. We're using the formula in the key of C to calculate the distance so that I can then create a system that works for all 12 sets of 7 notes. And you can include the other 5 notes as well, but we just want to look at them from a relative perspective or relative position so that it's totally maneuverable, which is obviously the design of the music system, which gets a little wonky because the piano is not exactly designed that way. But that's okay though. And then I've listed out our intervals. So if we think about our interval distances, we just kind of have to memorize them. So if I go 0 notes away, we call that a perfect first. 1 note away is a minor second. 2 notes away is a major second. 3 notes away is a minor third. 4 notes away is a major third. 5 notes away is a perfect fourth. 6 notes away, I'm going to call it all the time a diminished fifth, but it could also be an augmented fourth when in the Lydian mode in particular. And a 7 note away is a perfect fifth. 8 note away is a minor 6. 9 note away is a major 6. 10 note away is a minor 7, and 11 notes away is a major 7. These are the local distances you can have if you think about the distances as a track. We're going around the track, and there are 12 points around the track. So and that's how we're going to visualize it. Now, we can also visualize the track as having 7 points when we're thinking about our collection of notes that just include 7 out of the 12 points, those being the points that we're going to stop on if we're going around the block. We're going to avoid the other notes because they have dogs in it or something, and they try to eat us. They're not nice people, so we avoid those places, and we just go to the nice houses, which are in the 7-note collection. Okay, so then let's build this out, starting with the Ionian mode. How can we build our chords? Now, you're gonna possibly think, hey, this is an overwhelming amount of ways to build the chord. But if you think about it, I want to give you all the ways that you can kind of look at it from a logical perspective. If you're in a video game and you were trying to figure out a map, or you're trying to map out like in a history, and you're trying to map out a war scenario in Europe or whatever, right? You want that's how logical it is. You're just mapping it out, and that's what we're looking at here. So I want to just logically break it out as clearly as possible from multiple angles. So we start off with a triad. So a triad are going to be 3 chords. What happens with a triad? We want to take the collection of notes, which is 7 notes, And then we don't want to usually pick the ones that are too close to each other because it's too dissonancy to do so. So even though the collection of 7 notes are not all right next to each other, they're usually going to be a whole step apart because we apply the formula whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. We still want to take every other note so that they're not so close to each other. That's the convention. That's all we're doing. We're going around the block of 7 notes and we're stopping on every other note because it's too close. If we go right next door, if we go right to the neighbors, then we might as well not have left home. It's too similar. So a C major then is going to be starting on the C, and it's going to be taking a triad, which will be taking the C and taking every other note in the collection of 7 notes, starting from the C, applying in essence the formula whole, whole, half, taking every other note within it. Now, if you remove the C and you just call it like a generic major chord, notice that major chord doesn't tell you which of the points on the map you're at. It doesn't tell you if you're at an Ionian node or a Mixolydian node or a Lydian node, right? Because you would expect you'd be at one of those 3 points if you're playing a major chord. You're in a 7-note collection. You would expect if the chord is major, then it's going to be coming from a node that has a third that will land you on a continent and not in the ocean, right? And there's only 3 nodes that you can go from where the third doesn't land you in the ocean. That is the Ionian, the Mixolydian, and the Lydian. It'd be more specific, though, if I can remove the C and name it. I could just call it's a 3-note Ionian chord. Now, I could call it an Ionian C chord, but notice that's redundant. The best way to write your music in a way that's most efficient and the best way to make a MIDI program or a software is to name the chord by relative position so that you can play with it to each pitch. You don't have to choose one of the 12 collections of notes. You can easily move it through the 12 collections of notes if you don't name the thing by note but by relative position. So instead of calling it an Ionian C2 chord, which would mean an Ionian chord from the C, Ionian in C is redundant if I know the collection of notes, because if I know the collection of notes is the 7 notes collection around the key of C, the Ionian node will be a C, right? I already know that because I say that beforehand, right? So then I can remove the 2, and that would be just an Ionian 2. Now, why would it be Ionian 2 and not an Ionian 3? Because the 2 represents distance. So I'm saying it's an Ionian node plus 2 modal whole steps, meaning we're telling the range of the chord. How do chords normally get constructed? We say this is the starting point, this is the ending point. Now the major chord is the exception because it basically just means triad. If we say it's a major chord, you pick the first 3 notes. That's basically like saying we're playing a 3-note Ionian chord. Just pick every other note. But after that, everything's going to be named by what's the end point, meaning, or more precisely, what's the beginning that you're on, and then what's the distance to get to the last point. And then you pick up every one in the scale degree or that has a modal distance from there. So in other words, here, there's 3 points of information, just like algebra. And if I remove any one of those points, then you should be able to derive the missing one, right? So if I say I'm on the Ionian node and the last note is 2 modal whole steps, which would be 4 modal half steps, which would be a fifth from a scale degree standpoint away, then you can derive the last point. You can figure out what the last point is, and then what about the points in the middle? You take every other modal half step or every other note in the collection of notes, just as we do here when we say it's a major. It's a 3-note chord on the C. You take every other note from that point, right? Now, if you write it this way, you can also just say it's a 3-note Ionian chord, just like we did here, right? The major chord is just a 3-note chord. That just means you're going to start on the Ionian node and take every other note in the collection of 7 notes, which I would call every other modal half step, which is the definition of every modal whole step. Now, if you write it this way, you can also make it indicate that this is the tonic. So maybe you're playing an Ionian triad or C major and it's the tonic, or maybe it's not. Maybe it's the focal point of the song, or maybe it's not. If it is the focal point, then again, you could just have your system set up where you say, hey, look, we're playing around the collection of notes, 7-note collection from the key of C, and then say what the tonic is by capitalizing the chord name. It's a capital Ionian 2, right? And that will indicate that that's the tonic that you're basically playing in at that particular time without having to state it, and allowing you to name the collection of 7 notes all the time from the perspective of the major scale, because that would be just an easy convention. You can also then, if you name it by modal point, name the end points. You can't do that by note name, right? If I name it by note name, I could name the end note, but the end note is going to differ through all 12 collections of 7 notes. If I name it by relative positions, that would be like I'm on the planet and I'm going to go from America to Europe. It doesn't matter that the planet is spinning around. I could still say, look, I'm going from America to Europe. You're looking at it from space, from a different perspective. That's fine. But as long as I'm within the perspective I'm looking at, that always works. So that's convenient to be able to do. In other words, I can say it's a 1-5 modal range chord, or a, and let me show you what this means over here. How come I can't pull this down? Oh, there it is. It's way over here. So I could say that this is going to be a 1-5, meaning it's going to be on 1 to 5 from a natural number system, or it's going to be going from Ionian to Mixolydian, and you just take every other note along the way to get there, right? And so what if I add another note? Normally we call that a C major 7. So now it's a major 7. You have to say major 7 instead of just 7, because the just 7 has been now reserved for the Mixolydian, which has a minor 7, which is kind of weird, right? So what is it doing there? It's naming the note point instead of the node or modal point, and it's giving you the distance to the last note, which is measured in scale degrees, which are in essence off by 1, meaning it's the 7th, which is 11 notes away. It's an 11 note away, major 7 to get to the last note. What about the ones in the middle? You just add each one in the middle until you get to that last scale degree. So it's giving you the starting point and the distance. Now, if I name it, I could do this. I could name it by saying, hey, look, it's a 4-note Ionian chord, just like we did with this one, the major chord. Just start at the Ionian and take every other note in the collection of note until you have 4 notes. Or you can call it an Ionian C3 modal whole step chord. Now the C is redundant, so I'd rather just call it an Ionian 3 modal whole step chord, because you already know the collection of notes that we're in, which gives you the starting point and the ending point, which is 3 modal whole steps up, which means that it would be 6 modal half steps up, right? And so that you can derive the end point, and then once again take every other modal half step to get there to build the chord. If it's the tonic, you can call it a capital I3 chord, I3 modal whole step, or you can name the distance to the endpoint, right? So the distance to the endpoint, let me see if I can, this wasn't the best way to map this out to do this thing here. The distance to the endpoint would be a 1-7 modal range chord, meaning if you start at the Ionian, you're going to go Ionian plus 2 to 3 is going to be the Phrygian, plus 2 to 5 is the Mixolydian, plus 2 to 7 is the Locrian, which you can also call an IN modal range chord, or an Ionian to the Locrian modal range chord. See, so what if it's a, let's just reveal these all at the same time so I don't get messed up like halfway through this. What if I add the 9? So normally the normal convention would be a C major 9. So notice what the 9 did. The 9 doesn't really work from a scale degree standpoint, because now usually there's only 7 scale degrees. So now we've gone, instead of going around to the 2, which is what we skipped, we went to the 9. So it's basically the same thing. However, from a guitar standpoint, it should be an octave up, but in essence, it's like the 2 if we think about going around a circle, going around a lap. So once again, it's saying you start at C, and then I'm going to tell you the distance to get to the last note, which is going to be the 9th scale degree, which is equivalent to the 2, but an octave up if you could get an octave up, right? is going to be the general idea. So it'd be a lot easier then to say, well, I'm just going to call it a 5-note Ionian chord, meaning just like with the major that had 3 notes in it, you start on the Ionian and you just take every other node until you get around the horn back to the 2, which is the Dorian, because you know that you go in order. You skip every other one, which means that you're going to go back in order and pick up the one that you skipped after you go around the horn, right? You can call it an Ionian C4, but the C is redundant. It would be better if you know the collection of notes to just call it an Ionian 4 modal whole step, meaning you start on the Ionian, you go 4 modal whole steps up, which would be 8 modal half steps up to get to the last note, and then just take every other note in between for the collection of notes. So you can also make it a capital I4 if it's the tonic, and then you could call it by range, meaning start on the Ionian, go to the Dorian. Now, you can't go straight to the Dorian because it's right next door. You have to take every other note, meaning you're going to go from the 1 to the 3 to the 5 to the 7 and then to the 2, because there's only 7 notes in our lap as we go around the lap. That's just the normal convention. So that would be an ID modal range, meaning it's going to be Ionian, then the Phrygian, then the Mixolydian, then the Locrian, then the Dorian. All right, and then if we go down to the next one, oh, what happened? There, let's go to the next one down. I can't, this was not the best way to do it, I feel like. Okay. So now we're going to say it's going to be a C major 11 is typically going to be the name. Now the 11 is equivalent to the 4 that we skipped. So it's giving you the starting point in notes and then saying go from a scale degree distance standpoint 11 up. That's the last note you're going to add, and then add everything in between, just like we did with the major. You just keep on stacking the thirds, or every other note you're going to stack on top of each other. Now, oftentimes we're not going to be able to do that, particularly on the guitar, because we don't have enough fingers or strings. So we're going to drop things in the middle, but still call it a C major 11. That's why it's not very precise. Also, we're not so concerned with the octaves, because again, if I grab a 4 that's in local position and it's not an octave up, I'm still going to call it like a C major 11, right? Because it's still an octave. We're grabbing all the points in there. That's why it's not totally specific, these chord names. So it would be easier to say that it's going to just be a 6-note Ionian chord, right? Because it has 6 notes. Now you could drop some of them, but the point is you have to pick up that last note in order to call it a 6-note Ionian chord, right? Or you could say it's an Ionian C5 modal whole step chord. The C is redundant. It would be better to just call it a C5 modal whole step chord, because that gives you the point you're starting on, and the end point is 5 modal whole steps up, which would be 10 modal half steps up, or the 11th scale degree. You can call it a capital 5, I5. If it's the tonic, it's going to be a modal range chord of a 1-4 modal range chord, meaning if you start on the 1 and take every other note, you're going to get to the 4, which means it's an Ionian Lydian modal range chord, meaning if you start on the Ionian or 1 and take every other node, you get Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Lydian, Dorian, and then to the Lydian. Hopefully I said that right. And then lastly, we have a 7-note. These are all the notes that you can have that are in the 7-note collection. Now, again, you could add notes in the ocean. We'll discuss that more later. But that's when you would expect something funny to happen. Most chords aren't including stuff that's in the ocean, right? But you could, and then that's when you would think you would have a weird extension or something. So in any case, we could call that a C major 13. The 13 is equivalent to the 6 that we skip under a normal scale degree convention. It goes 1, 3, 5, 7, 1, 3, 5, 7, 9, 11, and then 13, which is equivalent to the 2, 4, and the 6, right? And so now, but I'd rather call it a 7-note Ionian chord. Now, we're not going to be able to grab all 7 notes on a guitar in particular, but if I get that last note, I'm still going to call it a 7-note Ionian. It would still kind of work in a similar way as like a C major is just assumed to be 3 notes, right? And so I could call it an Ionian C6 modal whole step chord, but the C is redundant. I'd rather just call it an Ionian 6 modal whole step chord. That's the point we start on. The end point is 6 modal whole steps up, which is 12 modal half steps, which would be the 13th scale degree. Capital I6 if it's the tonic. The range could be a 1/6 modal range chord, meaning if you start on the 1 and you take every other nodal point, it's going to get you to the end point of the 6, and then you just take every one in between on the way. So it would be an IA modal range chord, meaning it would be Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian to the Aeolian. Okay, so the modal half steps then is going to be for let's just look at all of them, the longest one here. So if we had all 7 in this order, it's the same collection of notes. It's just that we're taking every other note in the collection. So we would have half step distances. If it was 0 notes away, which would be the first modal whole step, it would be 0 notes away. If it was 2 modal half steps up, which would be 3 scale degrees, it would be 4. That 0 would be a 0 note away perfect first. If it was 2 modal half steps up, which would be the 3rd scale degree, it would be 4 notes away, which is our 4 note away major 3rd. If it was 7 notes, if it was 4 modal half steps up, the 5th scale degree, it would be a 7 note away, and that would be a perfect 5th. If it was 6 modal half steps up, which would be the 7th scale degree, it would be 11 notes up, which is an 11 note away major 7. If it was 8 modal half steps up, which would be the 9th scale degree, it would be 2 notes up, which could be 12. If it would be an octave up, we call that a 2 note away major 2nd, or a 2 note away major 9 from a chord construction. And then if it was 10 modal half steps up, or 11 scale degree, it would be 5 notes up, or 5 plus 12 if we count the octave, and that would be a 5 note away perfect 4th, or a 5 note away perfect 11. And if it's 12 modal half steps up, 13 scale degrees, it would be 9 notes up, or 9 plus 12. If we go up an octave, that would be a 9 note away major 6, or 9 note away major 13. From a modal distance standpoint, I'm measuring it from the modal point, which is a little bit more logical. It would be a 0 note away from the Ionian node, 0th modal half step, which would be the perfect first. A 4 note away from the Ionian node, 2 modal half steps, which would be a 3rd scale degree. 4 note away from the Ionian node, 4th modal half step, which would be a perfect 5th scale degree. 11 note away from the Ionian node, 6th modal half step, which would be a major 7 scale degree. 2 note away from the Ionian node, 8th modal half step, which would be a 9, which would be a major 9 from the scale degree. 10 note away from the Ionian node, 5 note away from the Ionian node, 10 modal half step, which would be the 11th scale degree. 9 note away from the Ionian node, 12 modal half step, which would be the 13th scale degree. So the notes, this is the notes from the perspective of the C, which we derived from our formula. So it would be C, E, G, B, D, E, A. All the notes in our key of C, which are all the A through G, not including sharps and flats, are present, but we skipped every other note to get there, right? So we went C, we went around the horn. And then if we put this into our buckets, then where do this fit in our normal kind of bucket list? Well, they're all going to be the major chords, obviously, because the chord constructions were built off of the major. So when we build our normal chord construction, just listing out all the chords that are normal, then those would all go into the major bucket. All right, so then let's say we go to the next one. What about Lydian chords? Chords built off of the Lydian. Well, Lydian is a major mode, so we would expect it to be similar to the major chords, right? So we're going to say then that we have a 3-note chord. It would be an F major now. So it's defining it by the note name. Now, if we remove the name and we just called it major, I wouldn't know which node it applies to. So that F, in other words, if I just see F major, I don't know. I would assume it's either Ionian node that I'm building it off on. The F is the Ionian, or I would assume the F is the Mixolydian, or the F is the Lydian. It's not specific. I have to figure out if where I'm at. It's not telling me where I am on the fretboard by just that piece of information. Whereas if I named it by modal point, it would be more specific, right? If I say, look, I'm in the collection of notes around the C major. Now you could say, well, why don't you name it as though you're in the collection of notes around the F Lydian? You could, because you might be playing in Lydian. That's what people do when they play in Lydian. But I don't think that's the most efficient way to do it from a Nashville number system standpoint. I think it's more efficient to name all 12 collections of notes with a standard convention around or applying the major scale formula to the 12 collection of notes. So I would still name the collection of notes if I could with the related major around the key of C, and then say if the F or Lydian is the tonic, then I will indicate to you that that's going to be the tonic, which possibly you can do by capitalizing the chord and show it that way so that you can indicate all of that together, right? So I would rather say it's a 3-note Lydian chord. So it's a 3-note Lydian chord, and that's still same construction here because the major just says you're just basically taking every other note in the 7-note collection. You're stacking thirds, as they say, right? Meaning you have 7-note collection, you're taking every other note as you start on the on the Lydian. You could call it a Lydian F2 chord, but the F is redundant. I'd rather remove the F, making it all transposable, calling it just a Lydian, which I'm indicating with a Y, because the L kind of looks like a 1, and I think the Y is safer. So it's a Lydian 2 modal whole step, meaning I'm giving you the point, which is the Lydian point, and it's 2 modal whole steps up, which would be 4 modal half steps up. If that's the tonic, the Lydian, you can capitalize the Y, and it's a Y2 modal whole step. If you want to define it by range, you can now do so, and the range will be the same for all related Lydian constructions. It would be a 4-1. I don't care if I'm in the collection of notes around the C major or any other of the 11 collection of notes. It's always going to be a relative position of a 4-1 modal chord. That means it's going to go from 4, every other modal half step, 4, 6, 1, which would be Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian. Or you can define it as the endpoints of Lydian, Ionian modal range chord. All right, let's go up to the next one and say, okay, well, what if we add another one to the Lydian side of things here? Add another one to the Lydian side. So then we can say, okay, that would be an F major 7. So once again, the Lydian, like the Ionian, has an 11-note away major 7. So you have to indicate that it's a major 7. Otherwise, it would just be like an F7, as we'll see in the Mixolydian. And the major 7 is actually less common than the minor 7. But in any case, so once again, that doesn't really tell me, though. If I see a major 7, I would assume that the F note is either the Ionian node, or I would assume that it's the Lydian node, because if it was the Mixolydian node, it would have a minor 7, and if it was any of the 2, the 6, the 2, 3, or the 6, it would be minor, meaning if it was the Dorian, the Phrygian, or the Aeolian, it would be a minor chord, right? But it still doesn't, it's not that specific. I still don't know where I am just by that chord on the fretboard. I'd rather call it just a 4-note Lydian chord, which would tell me that just like the major, you just take 4 notes, you just take every other one from the perspective of the Lydian. You could call it, that would be a 4-note Lydian chord. You could call it a Lydian F3 chord, but the F is redundant. If you know the collection of notes you're in, you can just call it a Lydian 3 chord, making it totally transposable, the 3 standing for 3 modal whole steps to get to the end point, the Lydian being the starting point, which means you can derive the end point by saying it's 6 modal half steps up or the 7th scale degree up. You can make it the capital to make it the tonic. The range could be named, which would be a 4-3 chord, meaning start at the 4, the Lydian, and take every other node until you get to the 3, which would give you Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, and then Phrygian, which could be named a Lydian Phrygian chord, right? All right, let's do the next one and say, okay, next one. What if we do this one? So now we're going to say it would be an F major 9. So an F major 9. So now we've gone past the 7, which is our normal range. The 9 then is kind of equivalent to what we skipped, the 2. So it'd be an F major 9. Again, the major 9 doesn't really tell me if I'm in particular, an F Ionian or an F Lydian, because I believe they're both going to have that F major 9. Let's check it out. According to that, yeah, they both have the F, so it's not really that specific. Now, it's going to be different than the Mixolydian, because the Mixolydian would have a 7, a flat 7, so it would have to be like an F7 for a Mixolydian. So it's kind of narrowing it down, but it's not really that specific. I'd rather call it a Lydian F4 chord, or I'd rather call it a 5-note Lydian chord, which means you just take every other note, kind of like the major construction with a triad, or a Lydian F4 modal whole step chord, but the F is redundant. If I already know I'm in the Lydian and I know the collection of notes, it would be better to just call it a Lydian 4 modal whole step chord, because then it's transposable. 4 modal whole steps means you go up 4 modal whole steps from Lydian, or 8 modal half steps, which would be the 9th scale degree, giving you a range of a 4-5 range, meaning you could name it by endpoints. You start on the Lydian and then you go up to the 5, which is the Mixolydian, meaning you go 4, 6, and then around the horn to 1, 3, 5, which would be Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, which could be naming the chord as a Lydian Mixolydian chord. All right, what if we add another one? Another one. Just like the other one. Okay, that means that we're going to have a F major flat 11, or sharp 11. Now, this is where it gets funny, because again, you would expect that all of the chords that are in our normal construction, meaning I'm not grabbing chords in the ocean. I shouldn't need to do something funny to it, right? But I do here. I need to put this sharp 11 in there. Why? Because this is where the Lydian is different than the major chord construction, in that the 11 is equivalent to the 4, and the 4 has that very strange 6-note away augmented 4th, which can now be called an augmented 11th from a chord construction. So that note, if it's an F major sharp 11, if I know that, I can say, it's actually specific. I can say, oh, that looks like I'm playing a Lydian chord, right? It's pretty specific. It's not going to be it's not going to be an Ionian chord, because it doesn't have that sharp 11. And it's not going to be a Mixolydian, because it doesn't have the 7. It doesn't have the flat 7 in it. So I would know, but it's ugly. Like, I shouldn't need those extensions if I'm playing notes that are all in the 7-note collection, right? It would be a lot cleaner to say, well, look, it's just a 6-note Lydian chord. Just take every other note. If you can't pick them all up, just make sure to pick the first and the last one, and we'll call it that. Or you can call it a Lydian F5, but the F is redundant. I'd rather just call it a Lydian 5 modal whole step chord, meaning go 5 modal whole steps up from the Lydian, which would be 10 modal half steps, which would be the 11th scale degree. Or capitalize it. If it's the root, you can name it by endpoint, meaning you're going to have a 4-7 modal range chord, meaning start at the 4, take every other modal half step or every modal whole step, which would get you Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, which could be named as a Lydian Locrian modal range chord. And then finally, we have a F major 13 flat 11. So the 13 is equivalent to the 6. For the Lydian, the 6 is normal. It's the same as the major, so we don't have to do anything weird for the 13, but I have to tack on the flat or the sharp 11 for the Lydian. So again, it's ugly. It's specific. If I know that chord, I know it's going to be a Lydian chord if I know my modal idea and I know that chord, but it would be a lot cleaner to just call it a 7-note Lydian chord. Right? Meaning you might not be able to pick up all of the 7 notes, but make sure you pick the first one and the last one, and we'll call it a 7-note Lydian. Or call it a Lydian F6 modal whole step chord, but the F is redundant. You can call it a Lydian 6 modal whole step chord, so it would be transposable, meaning start at Lydian, go 6 modal whole steps up, which would be 12 modal half steps up, which would be the 13th scale degree, or you can name it by range, starting and ending point, meaning go from the 4 to the 2, which is Lydian, and then go every modal whole step up until you get to the 2, which would be Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, or a Lydian, Dorian modal range chord. All right, and now if I look at the note half steps, if I go 0 modal half steps up, that would be the first scale degree. It has a 0 note distance, which we typically call a 0 note away perfect first, or from a modal distance, a 0 note away from the Lydian node, 0 modal half step. If I go 2 modal half steps up, it's the 3rd scale degree. That would be 4 notes up, which we call a major 3rd, or a 4 note away from the Lydian node, 2nd modal half step. If we go 4 modal half steps up, it would be the 5th scale degree. It would be 7 notes up, 7 note away perfect 5th, or 7 note away from the Lydian node, 4th modal half step. If we go 6 modal half steps up, it would be a 7 scale degree, 11 notes up. We call that an 11 note away major 7, or 11 note away from the Lydian node, 6th modal half step. If we go 8 modal half step up, it would be the 9th scale degree, which would be 2 notes up from the local distance, or 2 plus 12, 14 notes up if you take the octave into consideration, which would be a 2 note away major 2nd, or major 9. Right, and then that would be a 2 note away from the Lydian 8 modal half step. And then if you go 10 modal half steps up, it would be the 11th scale degree, which would be 6 notes up from the local distance, or 6 plus 12. If you take the octave, which would be a 6 note away. I have diminished 5th. It should be augmented 4th for the Lydian. That's where that distance has 2 names. So that's why it's red. But then I can also call it a 6 note away from the Lydian 10th modal half step. And then if it's a 12 modal half step up, which would be the 13th scale degree, it's 9 notes away, or 9 plus 12. If we take the octave, that would be a 9 note away major 6, or 9 note away major 13, or 9 note away from the Lydian node, 12th modal half step. These are going to be the notes. Again, these will change if we do this in Excel and I change the note name. I can easily convert these to all 12 collections of 7 notes. But the fact that I can convert them doesn't mean that we shouldn't be writing our software with relative position, right? We should be writing everything in relative position and then converting it easily throughout the 12 collections of 7 notes. And that's not really what we're doing. If I map this onto our buckets, notice we have the same names for the 3 note chords, the 4 note chords, and the 5 notes. So I don't know if you say F major 7, F major 9, if you're talking about the Ionian node that we're building from, or if you're talking about the Lydian node. And if I then add the next note up, if I have a 6 note chord or 7 note chord, I get the problem of having that 9, which is equivalent to the, I have the problem of having the 11, which is the 4, the augmented 4, messing me up. So now I have these chords out here that I have to have these extensions on, which in my mind, you should never need if you had an efficient system, unless you grabbed a chord that's outside the 7 note collection of notes that you're working in. Okay, what about Mixolydian? Let's round this out. We're on the Mixolydian, also of course a major mode. We're working in the major modes. Okay, so let's say we have a G Mixolydian. So the triad has the same construction. Now, if I say G Mixolydian, same problem. I don't know if I'm talking about the Ionian. I don't know if I'm talking about the Lydian or the Mixolydian, because the triad has all the same relative positions. I'd rather call it a 3-note Mixolydian, which I'm putting an X for the Mixolydian symbol, because the M looks like a major or minor. It's overused. So Mixolydian is what I chose here. Or you can call it a Mixolydian G2 modal whole step chord, but the G is redundant if you know the collection of notes is the 7-note collections around the key of C. Now again, you could name the 7-note collection. You could say, hey, look, I'm playing in the Mixolydian mode. I'm playing in G Mixolydian. Let me just tell you the collection of notes is G Mixolydian. You could do that, but I think the standard convention and the one used in Nashville number system right now is the right one, right? It's nicer to say, look, I'm in the collection of notes around the key of C so that you can easily determine which collection of notes basically that you're working in, right? And then say that the tonic that you're going to have in that collection of notes will be the G or the Mixolydian node. So I'm working around the Mixolydian node is the tonic, naming the collection of notes from the relative major, not because you can't derive the collection of notes from the Mixolydian node, but because the standard convention is to name the collection of notes by the relative major, and then you can determine that this is the tonic by telling people, or possibly by capitalizing the chord. I could just capitalize that chord to show, look, this is the tonic, and I think that's the most efficient way to do it. And I think that's basically what the Nashville numbers people are doing. They're writing everything from this perspective of the C major's kind of perspective, naming the collection of notes of the C major, even though they might be playing in a minor mode or Mixolydian. Okay, so I'm going to say, so I'd rather call that a Mixolydian 2 modal whole step chord, meaning you start on the Mixolydian, you go 2 modal whole steps up, which would be 4 modal half steps up, which would be the 5th scale degree. Or you can name it by range. You start on the Mixolydian node, you're going to end on the Dorian node. In other words, you start on the Mixolydian, take every other node, gets you 5, 7, 2, or Mixolydian, Locrian to the Dorian, which you could also call a Mixolydian Dorian modal range chord. All right, so if we add another note, then we're going to say, let's add another note. Add another one, just like the other one. So this is, now they had to switch to 7. So notice we could not go any longer with the major. Why? Because the Mixolydian node falls apart or is different. The interval that is different is the 7. So once I add the 7, it's going to get messy. So you can either add extensions, or they just said, let's just have a whole nother convention that represents that flat 7 in a major chord construction, meaning major third flat 7. So if you see just G7, then that convention basically means you're in Mixolydian mode. So it's specific, and it's actually specific. I think the jazzy and bluesy guys came up with that convention. It's specific, but again, you might as well call it a Mixolydian mode if you're going to do that anyways, right? I'd rather get rid of the G and just say, look, it's a 4-note Mixolydian chord, and then you just take every other note from the Mixolydian node. Or you can call it a Mixolydian G3 chord, 3 modal whole steps, but the G is redundant. I'd rather get rid of the G, just call it a Mixolydian 3 modal whole step chord, meaning start on the Mixolydian, take 3 modal whole steps up from there, and every other modal half step or modal whole step in between. 3 modal half steps up would be 3 modal whole steps up would be 6 modal half steps up, which would give you to the 7th scale degree. You can name the range. It's going to be a 5-4 modal range chord. Start on the 5, take every other node in it. That's going to end on the 4, or it's going to be Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, and then the Lydian. Notice you can actually list each of the points on the chord. What kind of chord is it? Well, it's a Mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian chord. Hold those down. Those are the exact points that you're going to hold down, right? Or just name it by the endpoints, which is a Mixolydian Lydian chord. All right, modal range chord. All right, let's do the next one. Next one. I want the next 2. Okay, so let's say it's a G9. So now they just used the same convention. So again, it's specific. It's just the first one that doesn't tell me anymore. But if I go up to 7 or past, the typical convention that the jazzy bluesy guys came up with is going to be the same, is going to be specific to the Mixolydian you would expect, right? Because that's the one that has the flat 7 and a major third. So, but again, I'd rather get rid of the G and just call it a 5-note away mixolydian. I mean, a 5-note mixolydian, meaning just like the major, just take the 5 notes. Or you can call it a mixolydian G4 modal whole step, but I'd rather get rid of the G if you already know the collection of notes, calling it a mixolydian 4 modal whole step chord, which means that it's going to be 4 times 2 or 8 modal half steps up, or the 9th scale degree, the scale degree being off by 1. Range-wise, it would be a 5-6 modal range chord, starting on the 5, taking every other note in the 7-note collection would be 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, or mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, which would be a mixolydian, Aeolian modal range chord. All right, otra vez. Next one here, we're going to say, what if we have, the next one is a G11. The 11 is equivalent to the 4 that we skipped. But notice we just have this convention that's just a G11, which means in essence, we're just taking all the intervals for the mixolydian, which are all the same for the major, except for that flat 7, 10-note away flat 7. So I'd rather call it, though, a 6-note mixolydian, meaning just like with the major, just take every other note until you get 6 of them, and then drop any ones in between that you have to in order to get the endpoints, and we'll call that a 6-note mixolydian. Or you can call it a mixolydian G5, but the G is redundant. If I know the collection of notes, all I need to do is name the mixolydian node and the distance, which is 5 modal whole steps, which would be 10 modal half steps, which would be the 11th scale degree, considering scale degrees are off by 1. It could be a 5-1 if you name the endpoints on the map. If we're just going around a circle, around the block, it's a 5-1 modal range chord, meaning start at 5 and then end at 1. Take every other note in the collection, 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 1, or mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, which means you can call it an XI or a mixolydian Ionian modal range chord as well. Finally, then we can say that it could be a G13. The 13 is equivalent to the 6, but we have the same convention, which means it's a mixolydian chord, right? Which means it's just like the major, except that it has a flat 7, 10-note away flat 7. So I'd rather call it, though, a 7-note mixolydian, meaning just add every other note until you get 7 of them, and then drop the ones in the middle, making sure you got the start and the end point. We'll call it a 7-note mixolydian. Or call it a mixolydian G6 modal whole step chord, but the G is redundant if I already know I'm in mixolydian, so we can call it a mixolydian 6 modal whole step chord, meaning start on the mixolydian node, go 6 modal whole steps up, which would be 12 modal half steps up, or the 13th scale degree up. Name it by range. You could say it's a 5-3 modal range chord. You start on the 5, you take every other note, every other nodal point, until you get to the 3, 5, 7, 2, 4, 6, 1, 3, or mixolydian, Locrian, Dorian, Lydian, Aeolian, Ionian, Phrygian, which means you can call it an IP mixolydian Phrygian modal chord range, modal range chord, or whatever you want to call it. What are going to be the note distances for the mixolydian? Well, if you go a 0 note away from, if you go 0 modal half steps up, would be 1 scale degree, first scale degree, it would be 0 notes up, or 0 note away perfect first, 0 note away from the mixolydian node, 0th modal half step. If you go 2 modal half steps up, it would be the 3rd scale degree, which would be 4 notes up, 4 note away major 3rd, or 4 note away from the mixolydian node, 2nd modal half step. If you go 4 modal half steps up, it would be the 5th scale degree, 7 notes up, which would be a 7 note away perfect 5th, or 7 note away from the mixolydian node, 4th modal half step. If you go 6 modal half steps up, 10th, 7th scale degree, it would be 10 notes away, 10 note away minor 7, or 10 note away from the mixolydian node, 6th modal half step. If you go 8 modal half steps up, it would be the 9th scale degree, which would be 2 notes up, or 2 plus 12, 14 notes up. That would be a 2 note away major 2nd, or 2 note away, or 14 note away major 9, which could be a 2 note away from the mixolydian node, 8 modal half step up. You can say that if you went 10 modal half steps up, it would be the 11th scale degree, which would be 5 notes up, or 5 plus 12, which would be a 5 note away perfect 4th, or perfect 11, which would be 5 notes away from the Mixolydian node, 10 modal half steps up. Or you could say that you're going 12 modal half steps up, which would be 13th scale degree, would be 9 notes up, or 9 plus 12, which would be a 9 note away major 6, or major 13, which would be a 9 note away from the Mixolydian node, 12 modal half steps. These are the notes if we were to derive the notes. And then if we look at our bucket over here, you can see that the major triad still needs to fall in the major bucket and is not specific as to which node we're building from, because it has the same name, whether it would be a G Ionian, a G Lydian, or a G Mixolydian. But as soon as we add that 7, they had to come up with a different convention, which means you might as well have named it off of the mode in the first place, which is probably what the jazzy bluesy guys would like to do, but they couldn't do it. Because, or whatever. So they were able to do it with at least the Mixolydian, is what I'm thinking. And see, then if you look at the whole bucket, then, so here's your list, right? So here's your list of normal chord constructions broken out in a way that makes sense, that gives you what you would want from a functional standpoint, right? You'd say, well, if I'm playing something that is off of the Ionian node, then what would I call that chord? You'd call it a major chord. Major, major 7, major 9, major 11, major 13. What if I'm playing off of the Lydian node? What would I call it? Well, you'd call it, if it was a 3, 4, or 5 note chord, you'd call it a major, major 7, major 9. But as soon as you add the 11, which is equivalent to the 4, because it has an augmented 4, that's when you do something funny. So the Lydian gets out of whack with the 11. Otherwise, so that's when you have to do. And then the Mixolydian is the same for the major, meaning the major is just like the Ionian, same construction, but it gets out of whack on the 7, which is even sooner, which means you could, so anytime you see this convention, you're thinking Mixolydian, because that's like a major chord that has a minor 7 in it, and the only mode that happens from is the Mixolydian, right? There are other minor 7s. The minor 7 is ubiquitous. It's more popular than or more common than the major 7, because all the minor modes use it, that being the Aeolian, the Phrygian, the Dorian, and the Locrian. So it's really only the Ionian and the Lydian that have a major 7, but the Mixolydian is the only major mode that has a minor 7. All right, and so then, so if you put it into this bucket, notice when I look at this is how you might see it in like a textbook. Notice when you look at this, it's really difficult to say functionally what I'm trying to get from it, from this table. It's not really helping me, because it's not giving me the, do you see what I mean? It's not giving me the chords by the nodal points that I want to build them from when you see this table. And I think that's an indication that, functionally speaking, our current system is not as efficient as it should be. We should have chord constructions that are completely transposable through all 12, melodies that are completely transposable, and a MIDI system or DAW or whatever you want to call it that's constructed in such a way that someone doing it by ear can easily convert whatever they built through all perspectives of 12 perspectives.